Welcome to another episode of The Craft of Living. I am Ante Jeroncic. It is good to be back in my studio, makeshift studio, and being able to share with you some very interesting ideas, I believe. I will tell you a little bit more about it in a moment. But first of all, a couple of updates, things that happened since the last episode that might be of interest to you. The one thing that took place, I spent some time going through my old episodes. I wanted, for my own purposes, to annotate them and to see the topics I've covered. I wouldn't want to repeat myself too much and share things that I've already shared with you in some past episode. I have to tell you that that particular exercise was not very pleasant to me, having to listen to the various verbal tics and different mistakes I've made in my earlier recordings. It is a mortifying exercise, but it is what it is. There is obviously an element of self-consciousness about it, which will not come as a surprise to you as anyone who is operating on his third language or second language, which English is for me, or for all practical purposes. It is actually the language I use most nowadays, but in chronological order, it is the third language I have acquired. It is always so frustrating to see not being able to be as fluent as I would like to be, but perhaps I don't need to go too much into this moment of confession and self-awareness when it comes to this issue. It is what it is. I mean, we try to communicate in a global world in the language that most people understand, so here it is. But in any case, it has been quite helpful. I think even with all the mistakes and perhaps the certain learning curve that is associated with the whole recording process and mastering of audio and video, there is still things I need to learn. I've received some good input, and please, if you have any good suggestions about anything that I could possibly change, do not hesitate to contact me right in the comment section on the YouTube channel, or send me an email, and my email is thecraftofliving@gmail.com. You can always send me a note. I am deeply grateful for any positive feedback, as is the case. I mean, that obviously is quite important for anyone who tries to develop something. Anyway, so that's the one thing. It's been good. I think that while I've been, while I've noticed some of the things that I would have done differently, I was, on the other hand, quite pleased of the things that we were able to cover. I think we were able to touch on some important subjects, some of which I will revisit, perhaps have a different take and a different recording on some of the topics I have already addressed, perhaps providing a more comprehensive or clearer articulation, a better recording on a particular topic. We will see if that will be the case. But I believe, apart from that there is a certain consistency to the topics, the approach that I try to pursue on the podcast and on the channel. So that has been quite good. I've said it before, and I will repeat this. If I had enough time and resources, I would certainly have way more dialogues and way more engagement and conversation with other people. That would be one thing. If I could change, that would be the one thing that I would change. I learn most from dialogues. I learn most from engaging other people, as most of us do. And having different voices would be so enriching, both to my audience and to myself. We will see. We'll see how it goes. This would require a different level, as I said already, in terms of processing, engagement, logistics, time. And so, I don't know, but my long-term goal certainly would be to move towards something like that, at least from time to time. In terms of reading, in terms of insights, I listened to an episode on the Rich Roll podcast, where Rich is interviewing and dialoguing with Scott Barry Kaufman. And I have benefited much from it. First of all, I did not know personally that Maslow never ever used this hierarchy, this pyramid of needs that we often see, right? When you Google Maslow and you want to learn about Maslow and you want to learn about self-actualization and the hierarchy of needs, you always will encounter this pyramid. But he himself never used that because life doesn't work in such a fashion. And I found this to be quite interesting. And I also thought about some interesting points that came out in that interview. For instance, how many young people are overemphasizing this idea of wanting to find a purpose in their life. They want to know what their life is supposed to be about. And they often come to their professors and they ask, professor, I don't know what to do. Or they come to other people of influence in their lives and they ask, I'm kind of drifting. I don't know what my purpose in life is. Well, first of all, when you're 18 or 20, you're way too young to be able to know what the purpose in life is. You have to discover this. And the good thing is that you can actually plug into many existing paths that already are there. And you just begin going on them. Like, where's your heart? Where's your passion? Pursue those things. And you will, in due time, discover what your purpose is. So I think the emphasis should be more on calling and on these opportunities that afford themselves to you. And the thing of purpose will, of course, become clearer as you go on. So when I talk about purpose, of course, I don't mean this in an overarching sort of religious sense, because we could say that my purpose in life is to worship God, to follow this or that religious leader. That's not what I have in mind. I mean the particular purpose connected with your own existence. So don't worry too much about that. I think that was an interesting thing in the interview and made me think about a little bit the fact how I would respond if anyone asked me such a question. He also, in response to this idea of the pyramid and the pyramid not being something that Maslow actually employed, Kaufman did, he used this example of a sailing boat. When you're in a sailing boat, there are certain fundamental things that need to be there, right? Hopefully there is no leakage, you have the necessary equipment, you find yourself not grounded on some sandbank, right? So the basic things are in order, because if they're not in order, it is not easy to sail. And so I think the image there is that, yeah, absolutely, some fundamental needs need to be made, need to be satisfied, I wanted to say rather, need to be satisfied in order to be able to pursue a full project of self-actualization. But even that is not correct, quite, because Kaufman notes that life shouldn't really be about self-actualization, because there can be a lot of narcissism attached to that, kind of too much of self-referentiality. It should really be a matter of transcendence, right? Not so much how I can find my purpose, but how I can serve. And that topic of self-transcendence is something that comes up throughout history in different philosophies and religions. I would say that the famous cave analogy in Plato's Republic could be read as the process of a person moving from illusion to truth, but it also could be interpreted as a process of divestment and self-transcendence. I think that is one way in which we could read that particular analogy. But in other religions, we also, in other wisdom traditions, we have this topic of self-transcendence being approached from different perspectives. So the idea of self-transcendence is not a new idea. The idea of divestment, the idea of finding something more than simply satisfying your whims, your desires, and even perhaps a too egocentric approach to self-actualization. There's something more than that. And I think what Kaufman shares in this connection very much tracks what David Brooks has in his second mountain sort of analogy, right? Most of our lives, we're climbing the first mountain. We want to achieve things. But then we realize that this is not what life is all about. Real purpose and meaning is really found in community, in relationships, and giving yourself for some higher cause. And you can just listen to any David Brooks lecture that you find on YouTube, and you will see this theme coming up over and over again. So there's some quite overlaps in that connection. So I found this to be quite meaningful and led me to think a little bit about myself and how I understand this whole notion of the craft of living, which I don't want to approach in a narcissistic, selfish, self-absorbed way, because in the final analysis, the apex of the craft of living is not just wisdom, but it is love, compassion, self-giving, self-transcendence, moving away from the false self in whatever way the false self is being manifested in your own life. So that is something that I find quite interesting and quite important. In any case, these are some of the things that have preoccupied me in the last couple of weeks, and I don't want to spend too much time on further elaborating them because I'm quite eager to actually shift to the main theme of today's episode, which is Heidegger in modernity, focusing on the essential and the simple. Some time ago, I stumbled upon a series of lectures that Günter Figal delivered in 2012 titled Heidegger in Modernity. I found those lectures to be very fascinating, connecting with some of the themes in this channel in a very direct way. And since they were given in German, I thought, well, perhaps I could share them on this channel. Not everything that Figal said, it would take too much time, right? Because those are long lectures. I think they're like 9 or 10 lectures, 11 lectures, 12 lectures. I don't remember right now. I have them actually here on my phone. But they are each an hour or so long or more. And so obviously I cannot summarize everything, but perhaps pick some of these important insights and pay homage or give credit to these great presentations that Figal has given us, that they're given in German, and so most people wouldn't be able to access them. And in the process, perhaps introduce you to some aspects of Heidegger's thought that you might find interesting. Now, as I've shared before, when I engage thinkers on this channel, first of all, I'm not engaging them from an academic perspective, right? These lectures are not meant to be, these episodes are not meant to be exhaustive presentations on a thinker's thought. They're my take on certain elements of a thinker's writings, how I understand them and how I apply them to the concerns of this channel, of this podcast. So keep that in mind, because sometimes people come back to me, oh, you didn't share this about the thinker, or this is just your take. Yeah, I plead guilty. I don't share everything, and I have certain takes, which hopefully I do believe that they do not do injustice to these individual thinkers. But, they are limited and have a certain focus to them. So please keep that in mind. In any case, let me not spend too much time introducing this, except as to say that Figal, as I've noted, has written a number of books, mostly on hermeneutics. One of his books is Objectivity, the Hermeneutical and Philosophy. He has written, again, as I said, books on aesthetics and on other topics concerning phenomenology, especially. So, not Heidegger, Figal begins his lecture by reminding us that we cannot really think of philosophy in the 20th century without Heidegger. There are many philosophical trends and important philosophers who, for better or for worse, have been impacted by Heidegger's thought. Hans-Georg Gadamer, Emmanuel Levinas, who is very critical of Heidegger but still takes Heidegger as a vantage point in some way. Karl Löwith, Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, Merleau-Ponty, Hans Jonas, and one could add also Charles Taylor, Herbert Dreyfus, and other thinkers, other philosophers in the Anglo-Saxon speaking world, in the English-speaking world. So these are some of the thinkers, some of the major thinkers in 20th century philosophical thought who have been influenced by Martin Heidegger. And importantly, this influence that Heidegger exerted wasn't simply an academic one. For instance, when you look at some of these names that I mentioned, people like Sartre or Foucault, their influence goes way beyond the halls of philosophy. They have impacted, again, for better or for worse, the culture at large. So it is quite impossible, therefore, to make any sense of 20th century philosophy, especially in the continental tradition, without considering Heidegger and the impact that he had. Now, Heidegger is known for many things, and one thing that he is known for is his eccentric appearance. His decided non-bourgeois gesture of having these specially made suits, like sports suits, that showed in his appearance, a rejection of convention and established philosophical norms. There were actually a number of youth movements in the 1920s, the years in which Martin Heidegger slowly comes to fame, which followed this anti-bourgeois sentiment, a number of kind of Jugendstil, right? This youth culture that rejects the norms and the practices and the aesthetic tastes of preceding generations. And Martin Heidegger is totally plugging into that sentiment, into that cultural moment, which was not quite the 1960s, but certainly had its own particular rebellious streak attached to it. For instance, in 1921 in Davos, Switzerland, there was this philosophical event that brought together two luminaries, one of them being Martin Heidegger and the other one being Cassirer. And Cassirer was a gentleman scholar, a neo-Kantian, deeply respected, who appeared as a aristocratic figure in a wonderful suit. He's quite tall. Heidegger was of very low stature. I don't know how tall he was. I forgot now, like 5'5", or in terms of height. So he was not a tall figure. Heidegger. I'm talking about Heidegger. But so Cassirer comes in this tall gentleman in this beautiful suit, and Heidegger basically shows up in this skiing suit. Now, those skiing suits are not contemporary skiing suits, right? And if you Google Cassirer and Heidegger and Davos, you will see how Heidegger appeared. But that was all intentional, right? His students referred to the suit that Heidegger had as an existentialist suit. Heidegger had it made for himself intentionally, so that in his whole outward appearance, he symbolized the rejection of contemporary philosophy and what academic philosophy at that point in history was standing for. To summarize all of this, we could say that in the early Heidegger, especially in those years, on early 1919 and on, he is a decidedly non-academic philosopher. So he posits himself, both in his thought and in his external demeanor, as standing against Wissenschaft, philosophy as a Wissenschaft, as a science, right? And that partially explains another feature of Martin Heidegger, and that is the invention of an alternative language. Now, anyone who has tried to read Being and Time, or in Germany, Sein und Zeit, has struggled to make sense of the language he employs. Now, if you know German, if you are able to read Heidegger in German, then what you're able to see, what he's often doing, that he is using, and I will be talking more about this, he's using old German words and then gives them a new significance. So for German-speaking people, they will totally pick up on what he's doing. Now, they might not understand his philosophy, but the words themselves will make sense. You'll be able to kind of understand what he's doing. But once you begin translating those words into English, that becomes incredibly either cumbersome or weird or strange, right? Now, when you look at a German word, and Figal talks about this, for example, Welten, right? And Welt means world, and Welten connects with this idea of kind of worldliness, right? And a German speaking person, I immediately understand what this is about. So when he uses the term "es weltet sich," it worlds itself, which is so strange, right? Or in the English language, for us when we read this, well, like, what is he talking about? For in German, you can actually pick up on what he is about, what he wants to do. So the certain strangeness is only accentuated by efforts to translate this very rich language, German language, into other languages. Perhaps just as a digression, for those of you who would like to learn something about Heidegger, there are many books that are out there that can help you. Two books that have been quite helpful to me, and I'm not saying that those are the best books, although I deeply respect the authors. But these are books that when I gave them to students, they were able to make sense some of the central features of Heidegger's thought. One of them is by Mark Rathhall, How to Read Heidegger. I found it quite helpful, very, very good. And then the other one by Lee Braver, Heidegger, just titled Heidegger. Two very helpful resources for those who try to dabble or try at least to understand something of Heidegger's thought. In any case, this aspect of language, the strangeness of language, in other words, is quite intentionally connected with his revisionist approach to philosophy. So this is again a philosopher who tries to practice a non-academic type of philosophy. At least those are the initial gestures that he is showing. And so he's inventing this new language. But he had a great mastery of the German language. I mean, he belonged to two art academies, the Munich Academy of Arts and the Berlin Academy of Arts, because his language was really outstanding and amazing, which when you read him in English, you would not think that that was the case. He influenced many people outside of the field of philosophy, people in the fields of literature and arts. For instance, the noted, very important German poet Paul Celan, who eventually committed suicide, unfortunately, read him very carefully. And there are also a number of architects who have read Martin Heidegger, which is quite interesting. There's a book that I have in my other office. I should have perhaps brought it with me, but it is called Heidegger's Hut. And I will talk more about this in a moment when I talk about the hut, actually. But it was written by an architect who was inspired by Heidegger's philosophy and did actually a thesis or some sort of project on Heidegger's thought in relationship to architecture. So that's quite interesting, right? In any case, we can say that Sein und Zeit, or being and time, is one of the five, perhaps three most important works in philosophy in the 20th century. right? I mean, it would be a very interesting idea, right? If you ask people if they would, if you ask people, could you list 5 most important works in 20th century, and perhaps even in the history of philosophy, it would be quite interesting to see what books people would list. But I would be very much surprised if Martin Heidegger's Being in Time would not show up on those lists for most people. I know that in analytic philosophy, so the philosophy practiced in the Anglo-Saxon world, Heidegger sometimes does not have a huge following as he has in continental philosophy, but that is a topic for some other time, why that might be the case. In any case, he is incredibly important, and he embodies, in many ways, his thought embodies the possibilities and tragedies, right, of 20th century philosophy. Heidegger has opened many perspectives, many new avenues of thought, but also contains elements in his thought, the elements in his thoughts that are deeply problematic. Personally, for me, it is the neglect of ethics. This is something that Emmanuel Levinas pointed out that shows a huge lacuna in Heidegger's thinking. But the point that Figal wants to make is that Heidegger's philosophy is a quintessential modern philosophy. And that is why he titles his lectures Heidegger in Modernity. And he explains it as follows. He says that Heidegger's philosophy is a self-articulation of modernity within modernity. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, it is possible to define modernity in different ways, right? Answering the question, taking a stance towards modernity, is itself a modern gesture. The question, what is modernity, belongs to the essence of modernity. Modernity, as Figal says, is an epoch, a period not like any other, and we cannot simply look at it in a historical sense as we can do with the Middle Ages. So the modernity isn't simply another segmentation of history, another period in history. We can only speak about modernity, Figal tells us, in the sense that we belong to it because it implies a consciousness of the present as intentionally articulated against the past. That is a very important point. It implies a consciousness of the present. So the presentness, the sense of presentness, as intentionally articulated against the past. So not simply the sense of I live in the present moment, but the present moment as being staying over against a previous period. So the idea of, because the Latin word for modernity is modernus, modern, modernus, which means new. This sense of newness. And he underscores this point, right? That modernity is always a sense of the present understood historically, right? In German, the word for the present is Gegenwart, understood historically, understood geschichtlich. Actually, Figal uses the term modernity as intensives geschichtliches Gegenwartsbewusstsein. So the intense historical consciousness of the present, or historicized consciousness of the present. So that is what modernity is. So we can call modern as something that belongs to our own time. It is the consciousness of the present over against the past. In that sense, modernity can never belong to the past. In other words, the language of the postmodern, once you define modernity in those terms, doesn't really make sense. You cannot actually go beyond this consciousness of the present as opposed in relation to the past period. Postmodernism, as Figal reminds us once you use this definition of modernity, is nothing else but a modification of modernity. Now I know that people can define those terms in different ways. People usually, when they talk about postmodernity, define it as being against the modern era, which, I don't know, is obsessed with objectivity, the universal, and so on and so forth. And then postmodernism is kind of a critique of that. Now, I have significant problems with that definition of postmodernity. I think a lot of those features of postmodern thought are already present in modernity. The greatest criticism of modernity can be found within modernity itself, within thinkers who inhabit modernity, such as certainly Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and others. In any case, that's not that important for our purposes here. The point that Figal wants to make is that for him, modernity is about this consciousness of the present, the Gegenwartsbewusstsein. And Heidegger articulates it quite early in his thought. In a lecture that he developed in 1923, Ontology, Hermeneutics of Facticity, he writes the following. This is a lecture in 1923 before he left as a professor at Marburg University. He writes the following. As this mode of knowing, philosophy has no mission to take care of universal humanity and culture, to release coming generations once and for all from care about questioning, or to interfere with them simply through wrong-headed claims to validity. Philosophy is what it can be only as a philosophy of its time. Temporality. Dasein works in the how of its being now. So perhaps not every single line and every single phrase here is quite transparent to you, but the basic point that he wishes to make is clear. So he is pursuing a modern philosophy. And what kind of philosophy is that modern philosophy? Well, it is a philosophy of its time. It can only reflect and work and make statements within the present moment. It does not try to deliver universal judgments or universal ideas that will be true forever, that can be simply handed off to subsequent generations. But every philosophy, insofar as it is modern philosophy, has to begin from new. Now, there are many things that we can find in Heidegger and many other quotes that I could give that illustrate that point. But I think that we can understand the basic issue here. The basic issue, the basic argument, the basic insight is that philosophy does not work towards any results which could have any timeless significance. Its significance lies only in philosophizing in the present. That is something that Figal underscores. Now, of course, we find this concept of philosophy in some way in other thinkers as well. For instance, we can look at the beginning of philosophy in the Socratic dialogues. Now, Socrates, he constantly exhorts us to think for ourselves, to think ourselves and for ourselves. But Socrates would not have arrived at this idea to term that particular conception of philosophy as the consciousness of the present. That would not have occurred to Socrates. In other words, the philosophy is a philosophy of its own time, and that it belongs to its own time is not something you find in Socrates, because this is an essential modern thought and modern insight, the concept of modernity. Now, Heidegger uses a very interesting description of this when he writes that what we should strive for is a certain type of philosophical wakefulness. And this philosophical wakefulness is precisely what he means by having a consciousness of the present. Right? So it's an awakening. It's the questioning. It's the alertness to the now, to the present moment. Now, there are, of course, conceptions of modernity which might lead us to conclude that Heidegger is a distinctly unmodern philosopher. And that position was certainly popularized by Jürgen Habermas in the Philosophical Discourses of Modernity, published in 1985. Because Habermas defines modernity as a process of disenchantment of the world, which leads to a rationalization and secularization of society through the influence, among other, of empirical sciences. Now, but once modernity is defined in such a fashion, like once modernity is understood in this Weberian sense of disenchantment, leading towards increased rationalization and secularization of society, a lot of the things get pushed out. Once modernity is seen as only allowing ethics as defined through principles of justice along Kantian lines, then any recourse to Aristotelian ethics becomes anachronistic. Now, when empirical sciences become the measuring stick for true knowledge, then there's no place for something like phenomenology and its attentiveness to experience. Once modernity is defined in such a fashion, along those Weberian lines, then there's a lot of art that has to be considered unmodern. If art, truly modern art, is art that's connected to the profane, then artists such as Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky have nothing to do with modernity, given their orientation to the spiritual realm. Right? Once modernity is associated and connected to processes of increased secularization, then a lot of this art that's happening in the 20th century by Schoenberg, or philosophy practiced by someone like Ludwig Wittgenstein, or the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke, has to be considered unmodern. And that, for many, would be, and for me, would be considered would be a preposterous claim to make. But once we refuse such a narrow conception of modernity, then we have little problems with defining Heidegger as a modern thinker, right? If we define modernity as having this consciousness of the present, rather than simply a increased march towards secularization, then Heidegger really becomes this, exemplar of modern philosophy. But there are still reasons why some people might consider Heidegger as being anti-modern or non-modern. And it is connected with this idea of the Heidegger myth, which is derived from certain sentences, anecdotes, certainly his appearance, which I've already referenced, and the aura of the rural, right? He's very much connected to this kind of anti-bourgeois, anti-city, anti-civilizational, so seemingly aspect of his thought and his living. And one of the best way to discuss this Heidegger myth is to ask about the places associated with Heidegger, which is his birth town, Meskir, and the village in the Black Forest, Tottenauberg. Now, why Meskir and why Tottenauberg? And I have to tell you that the Tottenauberg is actually a beautiful village. It is town. It is located, I would say about an hour or so drive from Freiburg. And my dad happens to live in Freiburg, and where the place where Heidegger lived and Heidegger taught, and eventually Figal took over after many years the chair that I believe that Heidegger held before. So when I visited my dad in Freiburg some years ago, we took a day and we went to Tottenauberg to visit the famous Heidegger hut. It is a cabin where Heidegger spent a lot of time. Much of his writing and reflecting took place there. It is a beautiful piece of Germany. Rolling hills during the winter, great skiing, cross-country skiing, hiking. It is absolutely a beautiful place. And he often writes about this. There's a famous essay that he wrote in 1953 where he asks, why do we stay in the province? Why do we live in the province? And where he reflects on this idea of the rural, of the primordial sort of connection with nature and all of that. But what is often overlooked when people think about Heidegger and this anti-civilizational gesture of moving away from the city and living a simple life, living in this cabin, is that the hut motif is essential to modernity as defined by Figal. Because other people had huts too. Certainly Husserl had his hut, Mahler, Gustav Mahler, the composer, Ludwig Wittgenstein, philosopher. There are many huts in modernity. And the Ur-hut, the prime example of that certainly must be Thoreau's cabin, right? Which he writes about in his Walden. And there is this essential quote that I've shared before, I believe. I might have shared before in one of the previous episodes from early on in the Walden, where Thoreau writes the following. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when it came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath, and shave close, to drive life into a corner, to reduce it to its lowest terms. That is a great paragraph, right? This idea of reducing everything to the essential, to the simple, to cut out the noise, to zero in on the present moment and what really matters. And in some ways, therefore, Thoreau's hut or cabin serves as an experimentation station, as a place of exploring what life really is, to reduce it to its lowest terms, to discover true life, to expose the illusionary. And that is only possible through this act of reduction, right? Trying to get what is the simple and the essential. Now, such a conception that we find in Thoreau and that we definitely find in Martin Heidegger has a distinct forerunner. And that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his Peter Island, where he withdraws to explore the natural life. It is also this idea, this motif of going to the essential, to the original, to the simple, is this ideal of Arcadia, right? Of this idea of going back to sort of the origins, right? And many thinkers in Romanticism are pursuing this notion of human existence as unencumbered by the ill effects of modernity, right? When we were connected to the pastoral, to the natural, when life was simple and peaceful and all of that. I mean, I definitely, those of you who are familiar, just as a side comment, with Tolkien and his literature, know that he definitely had that kind of element in his life and his thought as well. Deeply critical of modernity, of industrialization, and so on and so forth. In any case, so Martin Heidegger simply follows this rich vein that is present in modernity, which is about getting rid of the superfluous, getting rid of the stultified, getting rid of the abstract, getting rid of the dry, the artificial, the unnecessary ornamentation, going to the simple, going to the essence, clear everything from the table, like just take it away and come back to what is really the most important thing. And there is a beautiful paragraph in this essay that he wrote in 1934. Did I say 1954? Now I have two different years. I believe it's 1934, where he writes this essay titled, "Why Do I Stay in the Provinces?" And just listen to this rich imagery and how it speaks to this particular understanding of modernity as the consciousness of the present, combined with this strong motivation that this consciousness of the present has to be about the simple and the essential. This is what he writes. On a deep winter's night, when a wild pounding snowstorm rages around the cabin and veils and covers everything, that is the perfect time for philosophy. So imagine yourself in a mountain cabin. You're there alone or with some good companion, but I think being alone with your thoughts is essential here, right? So you're alone in a cabin, and there's this rusting environment. There might be electricity or it might not be electricity. The solitude only punctured by the sound of the wind that is outside. You look through the window, it is night, and you can see from a little bit of the light that's coming through the windows, you can see the snowstorm. So the sense of both quietness and separateness and solitude, that if you can kind of feel what he's writing about here, that is the perfect time for philosophy. Then its questions become simple and essential. Again, this motif of simplicity and the essential comes up here again. Working through each thought can only be tough and rigorous. The struggle to mold something into language is like the resistance of the towering firs against the storm. So that is an amazing paragraph. And I want to end with this today. And to set kind of the table for our subsequent conversations on this issue, and then kind of offering some pointers of how I want to develop this. So again, as I said already, it doesn't really matter how much you know about Martin Heidegger and whether you wish to explore him. But if you can only take this one idea, right, that perhaps what is needed and what the essential modern gesture is this gesture towards the simple and the essential. And we can apply this to many spheres of life. He applies it to philosophical thought, which will then lead him into some specific directions, some of which I deeply appreciate and some of which I find really problematic. But we can take the same principle, this motif of trying to reduce life to its lowest terms, right? To find what life really is all about, as Thoreau puts it, right? To suck out the marrow of life, to get rid of everything that is not necessary. That kind of a mindset can be applied to many, many things in life. And I have to say that when I think about my time that I have left on this planet, right? And I don't know how long it is, but when I think of my values and my priorities, when I think about how do I really want to live life, not withdrawing from the realms of responsibilities that I have as a husband, as a father, as a son, as a teacher, not withdrawing. That's not an option for me, nor do I wish to desire, nor do I desire it. I believe that community and all of that, and pursuing our vocational goals and interests is incredibly important. But how do I, within that sphere of these multiple commitments, how do I reduce my life to that which is the simple and the essential? Now I want to continue with this. And if you stay with me and you allow me to unpack this a bit more in the next episode, that will provide us with an excellent vantage point to dive a bit more into this value of essentialism, this value of simplicity or focus, which just happens to be one of the key values that I try to realize in my life. But for now, this is it. Thank you so much for listening. I wish you much courage, wisdom, and peace until we meet next time.